Hi, Glenn.
Hey there, Bob.
How are you?
Not at all bad on a snowy day in New York City.
It's pretty snowy where I am, too, in New Jersey. I should tell people, in case they don't know or are listening on audio, you're Glenn Loury, currently at Columbia, although ordinarily a professor at Brown, correct?
That's right. I'm on leave this year, and I'm spending it at Columbia.
Okay, and I'm Robert Wright. In New Jersey, as I said. And yeah, I've had about enough snow for the year, I think.
I'm sorry, because that's not the end of it, I'm sure.
No, and my daughter's hoping for a snow day tomorrow, hoping there'll be no school, which, based on the forecast, is plausible.
Well, we'll see.
So, I guess you watched the State of the Union address last night?
I watched with great interest the State of the Union last night. I did, yeah.
And you already have distinguished yourself from me, because I've never found these things all that interesting. I watched because I knew we were going to discuss it, but I can't say I watched with great interest. So what did you think?
Well, it's a spectacle. I mean, it's this kind of civic, religious event or whatever. It was very much hyped. You know, all of the TV talking heads, they've been talking about it and stuff like that. So, I watched out of a kind of interest in the political culture and all that. What did I think? So now I have to, render an opinion, an evaluation, which seems to be an occupational requirement of the pundit.
It's the reason you're here.
And, well, yeah, I guess so. Anyway, I thought pretty good speech. I thought interesting how the dynamics of call and response, audience participation, if you will, were altered by the kind of, concern to exhibit a interest in civility. Mm-hmm. People sitting next to each other, maybe not jumping up and down, nobody yelling out, "You lie," from the rafters.
Yeah.
I thought, the president sounded, there was a clear organization to the narrative there. We're going to win the future, and how we're going to win the future through, education, infrastructure, and innovation. This was the president as cheerleader in chief. America, a great nation. We got to be number one again. This is our Sputnik moment. I got that as kind of, I don't know, theatrics or rhetoric. I guess I wasn't persuaded, and here I'm a curmudgeon, I'm a kind of cynic. I mean, I wasn't persuaded at an intellectual level by any of it. I think the reasons why we're not number one but number 13 or whatever the number might be, depending on the measure, have a lot to do with us, and are not going to be responsive to or rectified by hortatory call to greatness. I mean, to the extent that we're not as great as we might have been or might yet be, the reasons are really quite deep, and they have to do with us. I mean, they don't have to do with if only we had a Marshall Plan for getting to the moon, the equivalent of that. We could undo all of this. Let me just give a concrete example in the area of education, and I'm sure the president knows this. The president, his people know this very well. I teach graduate students in economics at a good university. Almost all of our students are foreign-born who make it through this, high barrier of technical competency and mastery that they have to exhibit before they can be considered to get a PhD in economics at Brown. Mm-hmm. Almost all of our students are foreign-born. That is, MIT, I hear, in their economics department, has an explicit affirmative action program for Americans. For Americans, okay? They've got an informal quota, 35, 40%, whatever it is, for Americans. Yeah. And a colleague of mine who's been teaching there recently tells me it shows that when he lectures to the students in the PhD program in economics at MIT, I hope I'm not telling anything out of school, the bottom of the class is overly populated by the Americans who've been admitted according to MIT's.
Are most of your students from Asia, from either East Asia or South Asia?
I think that's probably right. We got a fair number from Europe and Latin America as well. I teach in the summers in Bogota, Colombia, to undergraduates at the University of the Andes there. Mm-hmm. I'm here to tell you that their level of technical preparation, these are, of course, self-selected students who flock to a summer school because they hope to get into UCLA or the University of Texas or something, and an American professor might help them and might tell them something that's useful to know. But their level of technical preparation dwarfs that of my quite fine, outstanding, on the whole, on the average students at undergraduate students at Brown.
But if these foreign graduate students stick around in America, they contribute, to American GDP, right? That's just not happening, you think?
Well, I don't know the extent to which it's happening. I haven't studied it. That's a fair point, and I'm all for it. The president did touch on that last night, though I thought even there was a kind of intellectual inconsistency in what he had to say. I mean, he called attention to the DREAM Act types, people who are perhaps illegal in status, but who came to the country with their parents as children and who've, done well in the country and deserve a path to citizenship. I agree with that for what that's worth. But he seemed to conflate that with the issue of visas for foreign nationals who have technical expertise and who might want to stay and pursue their careers in the United States, which I'm also for, but those are really quite different
Well,
issues.
that conflation is, to me, a very interesting one. In other words, between people at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum and those at the higher, and these are two very different things. And this is one thing I wonder. I mean, I get kind of tired of the kind of Tom Friedman-esque columns about how we're losing to China and we have to, let's get that Sputnik spirit back and we'll have more engineers and more scientists. And I think I'm not against more engineers and more scientists, but we also have an educational challenge at the other end of the spectrum where we're not, let's face it, not many of these people are going to wind up as graduate students at MIT. The people, most in need, the people who are getting the worst education, have the worst economic prospects in America, we would like, maybe the optimistic scenario is that they become mid-level managers somewhere. But that's a very different problem, and I wonder to what extent Obama, and I would applaud this little bit of subterfuge, I guess, if his aim is to use, kind of nationalistic competitiveness to sneak in some support, for people who, no, they're not going to become rocket scientists by and large, but to sneak in, some progressive type support of public education, I'd be all for that. But those are very different issues.
They are, and I guess, artful public management requires a certain amount of subterfuge. That probably goes with the territory, so maybe I shouldn't be so strict on that. He did, with the race to the top point,
right,
call attention, to the basic needs of, the more marginal people in terms of education. So I'm sure that's on his screen. But yeah, there was another, and maybe a larger sort of, I thought maybe inconsistency or intellectual problem that I had with the speech. And it had to do with the president as corporate cheerleader. And here I think Paul Krugman's point warrants to be addressed. Not that Krugman is necessarily right in every degree, but his point being that the interest of General Electric, the company, and the interest of the American people or the American working family or whatever, however one wants to refer to it, are not the same things. Mm-hmm. They're not close to the same things. Mm-hmm. Cultivating good relations with corporate America may be an important political strategy for fundraising reasons, for, sort of management of the image and the narrative about the White House reasons and so forth. The word gets about that the president is anti-business and that the Chamber of Commerce becomes his implacable enemy. That's bad for him politically. That's certainly the case.
Right.
But those things are not the same thing in my mind, and I think in objective fact, as promoting the interest of Americans broadly construed. Jeffrey Immelt gets brought into the White House as an economic advisor, and the talking heads cheer that the president has demonstrated his moderation and his sensitivity to concerns of business. People are talking about now businessmen have someone whom they can call in the White House, whom they know has the president's ear. Well, I thought the president was against lobbyists exerting special interest influence on the formulation of policy in the American government. And yet it would appear that it's necessary for him to demonstrate that, not lobbyist officially designated, but nevertheless privately interested, globally situated corporations have a way of getting, a whisper into the ear of the President of the United States, and so on. So I just, I'm not all that comfortable with my progressive Democratic president shape-shifting into Buy American corporate cheerleading, Go America, Go. I somehow feel that it abdicates a responsibility to parse, some important ideological and policy distinctions and to take a stand on them or something like that. I don't know. What do you think?
I think, of course, Buy America can in theory be justified on grounds of sympathy for the working class. As far as internal contradictions in the speech go, maybe you kind of pointed me to one just now, because another thing he talked about is tax reform.
Yes.
And if he's going to do serious tax reform, what those business people who now have a friend in the White House are going to be doing is calling their friend and saying, have him not do tax reform, because that consists of eliminating a lot of business-friendly loopholes, among other loopholes.
Well, he addressed that explicitly. He said he wants to get rid of the loopholes.
Right. No, right.
He said he was going to do away with subsidies to the energy production sector in the United States. And I don't know, man. Last time I checked, I know Billy Townsend is not still in the Congress of the United States, but the last time I knew anything in the early 80s, I did a lot of consulting with the energy industry as a kind of research economist. Those guys, they know how to protect their interests.
Yeah.
That tax policy hasn't made any logical sense for a very long time, and yet it's been deeply entrenched. Yeah. So I don't know if he's got the ability to actually do anything about it.
Yeah, that points to something. Yeah, I hadn't thought about this. That maybe the green energy stuff he talked about. Ultimately, the most common manifestation of that in public policy is through tax breaks. You're right, tax incentives you can call them, but the most well-meaning of those wind up being, often the tax shelters, the tax dodges that of the kind that you're then trying to get rid of through tax reform. So, although I don't know exactly how he plans to implement his energy policy, it seemed like a good enough speech. There wasn't the thunderous applause, and that's partly, I think, for the reasons you cited, the mixed seating, the era of the emphasis on civility in the wake of the Tucson shooting. Also, apparently, although I'm not a student of these speeches, he did much less in the way of laundry list, policy items, that some of which gratify your base in a way that makes them stand up and cheer, that makes your side stand up and cheer. There just wasn't that much of that.
No.
So it sounded like a kind of a tepid reception, but on the other hand, no big blunders, and he seems to have momentum at the moment, according to polls and so on. God knows more momentum than he would have guessed in the second week of November.
No, I agree with that. High unemployment rate, and yet his popularity rating still over 50%. Came through a lame duck session, and they actually got a lot of things done in the lame duck session, even though, you might not have predicted that going in. The terrible tragedy of Tucson, nevertheless, presents the president with an opportunity to look at his best at this kind of unifying theme and this kind of standing above the fray, calling us to higher ground, which he does so very well.
Mm-hmm.
So, sure, he's doing okay. We'll see how it shakes out. But there was one other thing, but I can't. It slips my mind right now about that speech last night. So maybe
when it comes back, you can insert it into the conversation wherever we are. But on the civility thing, you're interested in that issue, independent of the State of the Union address, right?
Well, I am indeed, because I actually have a mild academic interest in the general topic of public discourse, because I once, sort of worked on that and wrote a long essay that was published in the sociology journal about it, which I won't bore people with. But I've for a long time been a student of the Strategic Speech Act. The idea that talking in public is both communicative in a literal and direct way, but it's also performative. It's a way of signaling other things to an audience about where a speaker might stand or what his ultimate values are. And so whenever I hear people talking about talking, as has been going on in recent weeks, particularly since Tucson, talking about the climate, the discourse, insisting on civility, I'm always sort of holding my wallet, if you know what I mean. I mean, I'm kind of cautious. I'm kind of not taking them on face value. I'm trying to look behind it. I'm saying, what's really, really going on here? And so I've had the suspicion that much of this most recent promotion of civility as a public ideal, of watching out for the words that we use, of watching out for the metaphors that we incline toward, of castigating one another for seeming to, affirm extremism or dog whistle at people who would be violent or something like that. I think much of it is a kind of disguised effort to engage in substantive political combat, but without talking directly about the substantive issues on which the opposing parties disagree, but instead
what is the hidden agenda of people who are
well, if you lose a popular mandate election, as the Democrats lost in November, and you face, look at the healthcare legislation, which did get through, and yet the PR battle about the meaning of that electoral victory is far from won by progressive forces. If the tide seems to be going against you for a variety of reasons on a wide array of substantive matters, then perhaps you would repair to this other posture, which is in a way to disarm your rather more politically muscular enemies by encouraging them to bite their tongues, by smacking them down whenever they're more extreme enthusiasts let loose with something that doesn't quite pass muster. As I say, by talking about talking instead of engaging on the substantive issues.
So if you're losing a war, you're in favor of peace, and the Democrats were losing the war, so they're in favor of peace now.
Yeah, maybe that's what it comes down to. You're in favor. Can we all just get along? I mean, come on, we got to work together to get stuff done.
Yeah. At the same time, I mean, don't you think it is a fact? First of all, certainly seasoned watchers of Washington say more polarized than in a long time. Used to be that the Democrats and the Republicans would go have drinks. They don't anymore. They're closer to being true enemies. I think the political punditry has gotten more savage, more polarized. More people kind of wrap themselves in these electronic cocoons where they see their views reinforced, and certainly out and out crazy stuff. I do think that on the fringes, and at the moment more on the right than on the left, I hope I'm not being biased in saying that, but on the fringes, more out and out crazy stuff than in the past. I mean, Glenn Beck just says crazy stuff. I mean, if you really watch, I actually have heard you talking recently, I think, on a dialogue about how you finally watched Glenn Beck. And wow.
I check him out from time to time because I find Chris Matthews hard to take.
Yeah, but that's a different world. I mean,
no. I'm just saying they come on at the same hour on cable television when I'm just getting back to my apartment from work, and so I find sometimes I'm flipping over to Glenn Beck on a research mission, because I can't quite bear what the propaganda on MSNBC, but that's a separate point. Yeah, but yes, but I want to affirm. Yes, I do hear eerily crazy stuff, spooky stuff.
Oh, the
coming from Glenn Beck,
conspiracy theories, really, and playing, and I wrote a thing after the Tucson thing saying basically, why are we arguing about whether this guy was inspired by crazies on the right? We already have enough data. We know it happens. In fact. There was a guy, Glenn Beck was foaming at the mouth for months about the Tides Foundation in San Francisco, saying they're communists, blah, blah, blah. Police stop a truck, It's got several firearms. The guy's wearing body armor, or he's got body armor in the truck. He starts shooting at them. It turns out he's headed to the Tides Foundation to kill people. So we know that this kind of stuff has effect. And, I just think it's damn irresponsible of the people at Fox to have it on. I'm sorry. And I don't really, I don't like Keith Olbermann either. I mean...
Yeah, well, they're not equivalent either. But what I'd say to this is, yes, I agree with you that Beck is often over the top, the demagogic and the extreme, and it gives me the creeps, actually, to watch and to think that this has a large audience, a large following. I was visiting my father, who is retired in Central Florida, and getting a limo ride back to the airport in Orlando, about an hour and a half in the car with a guy who happens to be a deputy sheriff of the mid-Florida county, et cetera, and then moonlights as a cab driver. And I just listened to this guy for an hour talk about politics. Mm-hmm. I tried to keep my mouth shut and just listen and, take mental notes. It gave me the absolute creeps. This is a guy who said, I don't give a damn about that Obama, but I'd like to put a bullet in the brain of that Michelle. Quote. Quote. Why? Because she once stepped off of Air Force One in dress that he found to be less modest than what he would approve of for a First Lady of the United States. Now, this was a dyed-in-the-wool racist. Just one guy in one car ride. But he's a deputy sheriff. Okay? Listens to Glenn Beck, listens to Rush Limbaugh.
Do you know that for a fact? He said he watches them?
Yeah. We talked about this. Yeah, cause and effect. Who knows? That kind of guy probably seeks out this entertainment. It's not at all clear that the existence of the entertainment is causative with respect
in that case, no.
to his attitude. But sure, there's some chilling stuff out there. But however, go back 45 years. Think about the Black Panther Party. Huey P. Newton, H. Rap Brown, and all these characters. Think about the upheaval of the 60s. Think about the anti-war extremists, quote unquote, and so on. In a way, there's nothing new here. I'm not saying this to equalize right and left. I'm just saying that this is a part of the American political scene. There's not any doubt about that. And
but that was a scary time, too. This is a scary time. The Black Panthers were handing out coloring books to kids in school, I don't know, kindergarten or something, with a picture of policemen, and the caption was, "The only good pig is a dead pig." That's not good either,
Yeah, no, it's not good.
That's a time to say, wait a second, where are we going? This is a time, I think, to say, wait a second, where are we going?
But okay, agreed. We agree on that. But this crazy, crazy. I just don't know about that. Yes, some of these people are crazy. Okay, some of every faction is crazy. But is Michelle Bachmann crazy? Not in my opinion. She's just wrong, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Matthews on MSNBC calls her a balloon head, and then he gets a big laugh. She's a balloon head. She's a chucklehead because she says this or she says that. And all I'm thinking about is this guy in Central Florida who's looking at somebody, in this case, Michelle Bachmann, a woman, who gives voice to some of his sentiments, legitimate sentiments to be expressed in the political debate, whether or not one agrees with them, and then finds that being marginalized and caricatured by left-leaning journalistic sources as nuts. And the imputation is anybody who admires or supports this woman is a fool, is an idiot, is beneath contempt. Yeah. And I'm just quite sure that that's a long-run destructive, not productive way to conduct the political discourse.
I think when it's not true, it's and the reason I say this is because I just said Glenn Beck says crazy stuff, but I'm willing to defend that. It's crazy. I don't think he believes it. Right. I don't think Glenn Beck is crazy.
Right.
I think he's manipulative. But I agree. We should be very careful about it. We should be at least sure that we sincerely believe whatever we're saying, that we mean it literally if we're going to call somebody crazy. But the kind of characterization that I think is the most dangerous, and I absolutely agree with you, it's not productive to vaguely say crazy Tea Partiers. What the thing I think that is most insidious is the thing Beck specializes in, which is trying to convince you that certain people or categories of people are the other. They're un-American. They want to seize control of the levers of power and manipulate you. They are, because that's flipping a switch in the human mind.
Now let me ask you this question, because his thing about George Soros.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, if I didn't know better, if I didn't see all of the pro-Israel propaganda on Fox News as, a normal par for the course, if I didn't know better, if I wasn't in 21st century America, if I was in mid-20th century Central Europe, that would sound an awful lot like anti-Semitism to me.
Yeah.
Now, am I the only one who has this chill running up my spine? Because I have yet to hear, am I just wrong? Maybe I have missed it. I have yet to hear Abraham Foxman or anybody say...
I think Abe Foxman did denounce it.
Denounced the Soros vendetta of Beck's in explicitly anti-Semitic terms?
I'm
okay, good. To his credit, I missed it.
That he did. He was called on to do it by the left, and I think he actually did it. Abe Foxman at the Anti-Defamation League.
Okay, then I stand corrected.
Now, I would say, even if it weren't anti-Semitic, it would have been horrible, because regardless of how many anti-Semitic tropes were in there, he was taking this guy, Soros, and claiming that he's part of some conspiracy that's going to ruin your life, which is, a lie. And so the anti-Semitism makes it even worse, but either way, it's an example of exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, sure. We agree about that.
But yeah, he got some heat, and I don't know. I haven't been watching how his tone has changed, if at all, since Tucson. I had heard that the people at Fox were getting a little uneasy about him to begin with, and his ratings haven't been great. I gather in the last few months. So it may be that he's the next he's the other shoe to drop after Olbermann. I don't know.
What happened on Olbermann? I just don't know. Do you?
I don't know. I mean, the conventional wisdom is he's hard to he's a mercurial guy, or for whatever reason that. He is often, his career has been punctuated by abrupt endings. And after a while you start thinking there's a pattern here. It's also true that, for my money, he says, he's not in Glenn Beck's league at all, but he could be so hyperbolic in his denunciations of people on the right that I didn't like it, just as I don't like Michael Moore, even though in theory they're on my side of the political spectrum. And so maybe I can't believe it was some explicitly post-Tucson initiative to get this sort of rhetoric off of the airwaves. But it's a little odd, because his ratings by MSNBC standards I think were quite good.
Well, he was their top-rated person, yeah. I gather. So I assume there had to be some, backstory on that just wasn't meeting my eyes.
But I don't know, and I assume he'll be back on some network somewhere. Just as Conan O'Brien was back. And these days, if you've got a big name, it's not hard to find a venue. Increasingly, it's becoming the case that even if it's just on the internet, it can have a substantial audience.
Well, let me ask you another kind of question, which goes back to State of the Union in a way, and now I recall what I wanted to get to, which is this cheerleading thing, and this we're the greatest, or we should be the greatest, or we should be number one. We're number 7, we got to be the number 3, we got to be number 1.
Yeah.
And okay, so on the one hand, we're not number 1, and that's so in whatever the areas are, that's so for good and sufficient reasons. Some of those reasons we can adduce. And that requires criticism. I mean, self-criticism. I mean, a kind of rethinking who we are and what we're about as a nation. Not cheerleading. Okay. Now, I don't mean this to be criticism of the president so much as I mean it to be an observation about the constraints, the political, realistic constraints that seem to hamper leadership around a set of problems. The president has to come forward and call us to high ground by, this, as I say, exhortation, which is rooted in claims about greatness, claims about exceptionalism, claims about, American virtue, about, American ingenuity did this, Americans were the first to do that, and so forth and so on. And I find it pablum. Unpersuasive in the extreme. Really? I mean, all we needed to hear was be reminded that we're a great people, and then suddenly all of these structural and deeply rooted... I'm reminded of this book now getting a lot of play by the Chinese woman, Amy Chua.
Tiger Mothers?
Yeah, Tiger Mothers. So she doesn't allow sleepovers. So if the kid comes home with a B, that's a disaster. Okay, this is all of what I've been hearing. I haven't yet read the book. In the talk that's about the book and the controversy that swirls around it and so forth and so on. And what I'm thinking is, man, the notion of discipline and what one would impose on one's children and what kind of parental expectations and so forth, well, that's quite a distance from what's typical of, and I live in an upper middle class community and I've got 2 kids in college right now, was characteristic of the adolescent social universe that I got exposed to indirectly through my children in Brookline, Massachusetts. We're a long way from that. But no, we're the greatest people. We've got to do this. I wonder why it has to be that way. Why we can't be sober, critics of our own shortcomings. Why does America have to be the greatest? I mean, who made it into a contest?
Yeah, and of course this was kind of a theme in the State of the Union speech. You're to some extent preaching to the choir here. I'm very anti-American exceptionalism. First of all, I get tired of people citing features of countries that are actually quite commonplace and acting as if we're the only one. It's like you hear this, more on the right than the left, but kind of, this is an exaggeration, but unlike every other country, we alone, get to vote for our leaders or stuff like that. Yeah. There's that kind of sense that we are the sole beacon of freedom in the world. There's separately, and I want to say, I think a lot of this stuff is pretty common. I mean, people are built with an egocentric bias by natural selection. It translates to the group level in terms of thinking, well, our family is in the right in this particular dispute, our tribe is in the right in this particular dispute. But I just see it everywhere. It drives me nuts. China. All this whining about their currency policy. They manipulate their currency. Well, first of all, we have professed to manipulate ours. I mean, we've always said things like, well, we have a strong dollar policy right now, and we've acted as if, although we may not have actually had much leverage, we've acted as if we would do what it took to keep the dollar pegged where we thought it should be, A. But B, you got to understand, when you ask China to appreciate their currency, they have basically loaned us a ton of money. And to ask them to appreciate their currency is basically like asking them to forgive a lot of the loan, because what the effect of that is to reduce the amount of money that we have to repay them. And, but I have never seen that point made on an op-ed page in all of America. Maybe somebody's done it, but you just... the inability, I think the fundamental problem of the world is the inability or unwillingness of people to look at things from the point of view of people on the other side of various fences. And I do suspect it's worse in America than in many countries. I certainly don't think the problem is confined to America, but I think for various historical reasons, we've become a particularly glaring example.
But there's incoherency here. I mean, so the president extols the South Korean education system, and I don't doubt that it's very effective. Okay. On the other hand, I mean, have you got any idea what it's like to be an adolescent trying to get into one of these colleges in South Korea?
Right.
These families are spending as much on cram schools for their kids to get into these exams as they are on housing.
Yeah.
I don't know what the suicide statistics look like. They would be interesting to see.
Right.
It's a different culture and it's a different world, so one wants to be careful with comparisons. But I'm not sure American parents want to visit that kind of intensity, that kind of obsession, that kind of hyper-competitive dependence upon paper and pencil exams for the rationing of opportunity. That is and that kind of sort of diversion of time from every other aspect of human development that is going on in adolescence to the activity of preparing oneself.
And in that sense, I would say that actually David Brooks wrote a column in response to the Amy Chua thing, a kind of against Tiger Mother's column that was on the one hand kind of implicitly nationalistic. It was kind of a way of saying, But on the other hand, I think you would applaud it. Did you read the column?
No, I didn't. I heard about him saying there about the cognitive effort it takes to have a sleepover with 14-year-olds.
Yeah, he was saying, look, people aren't just, standardized taking machines. You need social development. It was a way of saying, look, our system, isn't so bad, damn it. You know, the American system where there's more of a three-dimensional development in his view of the kid. I think there's I don't know I don't know if there is something to that. I can't do the cross-cultural comparison, but I would say as a father of teenage kids, you know, one of whom's in high school, one of whom's in college, that when you start talking about more engineers, more scientists, personally, I think there is plenty of pressure on kids who are at the upper end of the achievement scale, right?
There's enormous pressure on these kids, unbelievable pressure.
And that's not the part of their development that I think we most need to tend to.
Yeah. I wonder if you agree with me about too many lawyers.
I've always agreed with you about, you know.
Well, I see my most talented students who indeed are not taking science and mathematics. They're taking philosophy and sociology and history and literature more often than they're taking science and mathematics. They're getting amazingly good educations, and they're really interesting people, critical thinkers, independent-minded, and that's all for the good in our democracy. I just wish fewer of them would choose to go to law school.
Yeah, no, you know the old joke.
Sorry, my lawyer friends out there, but
you know the old joke. Have you heard that they're starting to use lawyers? Psychologists are starting to use lawyers in experiments instead of laboratory rats. You know that joke?
No, I don't know the joke.
And you say why? And you say. Because there's more of them and you don't get emotionally attached. and then you follow that up by saying, plus, there's some things that a laboratory rat won't do.
That's a good joke.
Yeah.
Okay, so enough of dumping on the lawyers. Just one other thing about education, Bob. The president says our teachers should be respected more than they are in South Korea. They're like heroes and national treasures, and here we treat them like whatever. Would that it were so, that one could elevate the status in the minds of the populace of an occupation merely by saying words. But in fact, the lack of respect, to the extent that it's there for teaching as a profession, in my mind, has a lot to do with the lack of outstanding and impressive performance by the range of people who are going into the profession, which has a lot to do, presumably, I would imagine, with the rewards that are available to people and the structure of things as they exist in the country. But it's certainly not because we Americans have chosen out of pique, to elevate, to allocate less esteem to teaching as a profession. When the smartest people in the class choose to go into teaching, which may have to do with union work rules, maybe, I don't know. I mean, when they choose to go into teaching, which may also have to do with the extent to which we reward people for doing that job, but that's a long and a hard story, then the profession will get more esteem, but not before.
Yeah, I mean, the unions, I think, work both ways. I mean, it may be that in some ways they're impediment. They have, on the other hand, been a force in raising the salary level of teachers.
Yeah, and I want to be careful about
which I think is good.
Right.
And I agree. It's education's a tough one. I mean, we've been in a number of school systems, and I find it largely comes down to who the principal is who's doing the hiring of the teachers, and it's very difficult. Finding good people to hire is hard in the world generally, and hiring a good principal is just absolutely crucial. And I think one thing people who think the magic solution would be to disempower the unions and thereby get rid of tenure and whatever, don't realize that you will still face this very crucial difficulty that if anything, the principal would become more important as a hire, and that's just a very challenging thing, and it, whether in the private or the public sector, I've seen some really bad teachers and some really good ones in the public schools. I don't know. I don't have a cure.
Yeah,
I've just said everything I know. Now, you wanted to talk about world affairs.
Right. Well, there's a lot to say, and there's so little time. So
yeah,
let's go. So, I want to talk about world affairs. So, I guess one of us has to start. You want to start?
Well, I don't know. You wanted to talk about Israel-Palestine, and I said let's throw in Arab unrest while we're at it. So you can You can go first.
Okay, well, regarding Arab unrest, see unfolding before my very eyes, and I'm no expert, although as a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, I do try to follow these things as closely as my other work will permit.
Now, I was shocked to find out you are on the Council of Foreign Relations. So you're like the far left, right, of the CFR.
Well, I'm not a very active participant in CFR affairs, but I did get myself nominated and elected going back to the 1990s because of my friendships that I had with people at the Kennedy School of Government when I was teaching at Harvard. And I developed some relationships there, and there's a philosophy amongst many at the council that they need a broad range of different types of people, to participate in intelligent discussions about foreign affairs and so forth. So they were willing to reach out to a guy who mainly writes about domestic issues and so on. So,
you have to pay dues or anything? Or you're just
you pay, a nominal amount per year of dues, and you get Foreign Policy magazine in the mail, and you get a lot of invitations.
Foreign Affairs, excuse me.
I beg your pardon, you're quite right. My bad. And so on. And I follow these events to the extent that I can, and I'm struck by what looks like it could be the beginnings of some really historic developments in terms of bottom-up change in the autocratic states of the Middle East, with what has happened in Tunisia and with what is going on in Egypt, and there are dominoes after that one imagines could fall, and that's a game changer as far as I can see of some really world historic character should events continue to unfold in this direction. And it got me to thinking about a number of different things, the impact of technology on political change,
absolutely,
but also about the kind of difficulties of America's posture, sort of theory of our foreign policy in that region, in which we are on the one hand, pro-freedom and pro-democracy, and yet on the other hand, we seem to be engaged in activities that are, cut across the grain for the sort of popular sentiment of many of the polities in the countries of that region, which makes them anti-American, and should we succeed in the promotion of democracy, their governments would be anti-American. So we have to support autocracy in order to keep our sort of strategic hand valid, and yet our ideology is a mouthing of democracy that it's not even clear that we believe in. We didn't believe in it when the Hamas were democratically empowered in Palestine. We didn't believe in it, or don't believe it, when the Hezbollah through the ballot box get power in Lebanon, and I doubt that we're going to believe in it if anywhere near radical Islamist government were to come to power in Egypt.
In Egypt?
My God.
That would be a game changer.
My God.
I mean, depending on how radical. But I think this partly gets back to what we were talking about earlier, a kind of an American solipsism. I think there's been this illusion that people are slowly getting disabused of that. Look, if in any country you put the people in charge, you have a real democracy, well, then you'll have a government that loves America, right? I mean, that was the naive expectation of some people going into Iraq, right? But in fact, one thing you're hearing from a government that actually is now somewhat representative of the people is, we want the American troops out, out, out. I mean, I think there were people who thought it was on the one hand going to be a client state and on the other hand going to be a democracy. But no, I'm sorry, it's not the case that everyone loves us, and particularly in the Middle East. And you're right that it's a tough one, and it's related to the technology issue, I think, in the sense that, I mean, I'm a little bit of a technological determinist. In this realm, I've been arguing for some time that, yes, modern information technology does tend to decentralize power. It does tend to undermine centralized authoritarian governments. And I think you see signs of this in China, certainly in the Arab world. And if I could just pause, and I'll let you talk, but I do want to get in one point I just haven't heard, which is that, when the Tunisian thing happened, naturally some supporters of the Iraq War said, well, had we not implanted democracy in Iraq, this might never have happened in Tunisia. I think it's in a certain sense, the exact opposite. I think Tunisia is the case against the Iraq War, because what it tells you is let nature take its course. The drift of technological evolution is, it doesn't guarantee you'll get democracy in every case, but it tends to be anti-authoritarian. So it was silly to think that if we don't personally get rid of Saddam Hussein, he will be there forever. I mean, I think there's enough, inherent undermining of authoritarian power that we don't really have to give it a lot of assistance. What we need to do is plan for the almost inevitable day when stuff like this happens. And now we're back to America's policy dilemma, right? On the one hand, we got to do business with these people. Egypt is important in a million ways. But let's face it, history is not on the side of authoritarianism. So how do we position ourselves to minimize the blowback we get when the people actually take charge? If you get this happy outcome where you really do transition rapidly to a true democracy, of course, which is not guaranteed. But anyway, those are my...
No, I think this is a very smart point about, because it's about the counterfactual. Okay, we can intervene or not. Okay, so then what happens in the event of not intervention? Okay, so the stasis hypothesis, the notion that things are going to just be what they are going forward, unless we act, nothing will change, would seem to be wrong on the grounds that you've just said. And while this argument may not be being made in the American discourse, I heard someone on the BBC not long ago make precisely this argument in a debate about Tony Blair's appearance before the commission there investigating the British participation in the Iraq War, and a back and forth between two advocates of either side of the legitimacy of Blair's position. And the guy who was critical of Blair was saying, in response to the claim that, Saddam Hussein was a tyrant and, we've liberated the country, just what you said, which is that, who's to say that there wouldn't have been significant change there, notwithstanding that, and then he listed 8 or 10 different factors, among which the technological revolution and events in other parts of the world were among them, to justify that position. And then I think, how many dead in Iraq? 1 million Iraqis? I don't know.
I think that's a high-end estimate.
Okay,
I think everyone agrees it's in 6 figures, and probably the number of civilian casualties is in 6 figures. But at the
that's a very large number of people. Saddam Hussein was going to kill. Saddam Hussein would have killed that many anyway, and the people would have sat still for it. I mean, I don't know. What about the sectarian division between Sunni and Shia, which is now a principal fault line in Iraqi politics and will be for some time?
Well, and the fact that Christians were allowed to worship under Saddam Hussein.
What about the refugees? What about the displaced persons in Syria and Lebanon, wherever they are? The hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people whose lives have been, the enormity of the negative impact, and then the kind of arrogance of us. I mean, I remember Zell Miller's speech from no one remembers this, from the 2004 Republican Convention. This was the Democratic former governor of Georgia speaking at the Republican Convention against John Kerry's candidacy, saying of Kerry that he shouldn't be trusted because he understood American forces on the ground in Iraq as occupiers and not liberators. As if you were to acknowledge the fact that they were an occupying force and would be so seen by the indigenous population, was to presumptively discredit you from being the leader of the American government. I guess we can't relitigate the Iraq decision, but...
No, I always enjoy it, but I'm afraid it is a little late. I just hope that they don't manage to turn the Tunisia into some kind of illogical vindication of the decision to invade Iraq, when I think it's kind of the opposite. In Egypt, it's still unfolding. It may have changed by the time we end this. Stuff is fluid in that part of the world, and look, it's got to happen sooner or later. I hope it happens as gracefully as possible. I think, in the long run,
you'd be very lucky.
It's probably a good thing, and I think we have to live with the fact that we may not love what happens when you let people vote. I mean, I hope that's what happens. I hope you do wind up with true democracies, which is not always the immediate effect, of course, of an undermining of an authoritarian. But, these Islamists that we find so scary, you may find that you can't guarantee it. They may change their character a little in the direction of pragmatism if they find themselves actually running a government of a state. We'll see. But
okay, and that brings us to perhaps finally for this conversation the leak of documents and the
WikiLeaks, right?
The Palestinian Israeli
the Al Jazeera version of WikiLeaks.
The Al Jazeera event, yeah, and what that exposes about the negotiations and about the prospects going forward. And this is something you've written, I think, very insightfully about. So, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not that well versed in this in particular. I've written about the Israel-Palestine thing. My sense from reading some of the secondary coverage is that what was revealed was that the Palestinian negotiators had made really significant concessions a few years ago, and including basically saying things like, as for the right of return of the refugees, yeah, we're going to more or less fold on that, and accept compensation or whatever, and yeah, we'll accept this settlement and that settlement and that settlement. I mean, these are things that most serious students of the process, I think, thought, yes, would happen in due course, but they're things that Palestinian leaders couldn't afford to be seen doing, just as people on the Israeli side, if they're going to make really serious concessions, might not want to break it to their people right at the time that they're negotiating, right? You got to turn around and then sell it to the people once you get a deal. But anyway, it's thought that this, along with some specific comments that were made, the kind of flattering comments that apparently Palestinians made to Israeli leaders, are the kind you just make in the course of diplomacy. Anyway, it's thought that all of this is going to be a serious problem for the Palestinian Authority, for the leadership in the West Bank. It's not going to be well received, and probably will tend to strengthen Hamas in Gaza, or in terms of the competition for the overall allegiance of the Palestinian people.
So let me ask you just a question about the right of return issue. So what I read in the newspaper, correct me if I get these facts wrong, revealed by these documents is that the Palestinian negotiators had offered a symbolic position of 10,000 repatriated refugees a year for 10 years.
Uh-huh.
And that the Israelis had countered-offered 1,000 a year for 5 years. I hope that I have not gotten those numbers wrong. This is something I could be checked in the newspaper. But that's what I just recall from memory. And I'm telling you what I thought when I read this, and I have no dog in this fight, okay, is, what? 10,000 a year for 10 years? That's only 100,000 people spread over 10 years. That really is basically conceding the point and asking for some symbolic gesture.
Yeah.
And then the Israeli response is, what? What? 1,000? No, not 10,000. So that's like saying, screw you, guy. Okay? And it reveals what commentators have said it reveals is the extraordinary weakness of the Palestinian negotiating team in these negotiations, that's the way that the Israelis felt that they could, with American oversight, respond to this Palestinian proposal of a symbolic gesture. Mm-hmm. Now, I understand about the right of return can't be taken literally, or else it would mean the destruction of Israel. I understand that people make that argument. Okay, I understand that people make that argument. But from the Palestinian point of view, you were saying solipsism. You were saying looking at it from the Palestinian point of view, for people who've been living in refugee camps and such for generations, who feel that they've been historically dispossessed in what they regard as a historical crime.
Yeah.
That would be awfully hard for me to swallow if I were in that situation.
Well, if I were to give advice to Israel, and I'd be happy to give advice to both sides and point to what I think are the deficiencies of their perspective, but I don't think Israel pays enough attention to the fact that, in my view, the more dignity you can preserve on the part of Palestinians in the course of a settlement, the more secure Israel will be. That's my view, is that if you want look, first of all, I don't think there's any hope for any progress anytime soon, but if you were to have a two-state solution, I think the more Palestinians think, hey, we got something here, we won, our dignity is intact, the more secure Israel is going to be, because the less receptive Palestinians will then be to the inevitable dead-enders who are going to want to continue to resort to terrorism until they occupy Israel itself. So, and I don't think, well, anyway, I've got all kinds of sermons I could deliver on this subject. It's very depressing.
Well, how about the impose a solution rather than wait for a negotiated solution to come up from between the two parties posture that you've taken in print recently?
Yeah, I wrote this piece. I was I was a guest columnist just on a ad hoc basis.
At the New York Times blog?
Well, this was in the paper. So it's part of the deal where I did the blog at the Times for a year. You have a few occasions where you're going to fill in for a guest columnist.
Yeah.
So that's different from an op-ed. You don't have to sell the idea to the editors, right? You just send in the piece and they print it. Yeah, so I thought, well, let's do crazy stuff.
What kind of reaction did you get to that modest proposal?
Well, let me say what it was after Hillary Clinton had given this address saying it's up to the two sides to come up with a solution. The solution cannot be imposed from the outside. And I said, first of all, you're living in a dream world if you think the two sides are going to come up with anything anytime soon. And I think it has to happen soon for the sake of American national security, if nothing else, and also for Israel's and the Palestinians. And I said, in fact, a solution can be imposed. In principle, if Obama were this bold, you could initiate action in the Security Council that could even go to the point of specifying the borders. And now you would say, look, there has to be a referendum among the Palestinians that they want to go this route. If so, then they have an election, and anyone who is elected has to swear allegiance to a constitution that recognizes the right of Israel to exist within the borders that are defined by the Security Council. So, but I was just saying, it's not that I think this is going to happen, because I don't think Obama is that venturesome, let's say, adventurous, even though I think he cares about this issue. But I thought there's value in arguing that, A, this could be done, and just getting it out there as a kind of an outlier, Sometimes the way you legitimize more moderate ideas is to get a less moderate idea out there in some sort of mainstream credible publication, right?
Yeah. But I have a question.
A lot of people did, Glenn.
Yeah, I would imagine so. And it has to do with what I see as a kind of, tension, if not contradiction in this argument, which is on the one, not in the argument itself, but in the situation, which is that on the one hand, if the UN were to be an agent of this kind of external imposition, this kind of formal expression and to enforcement, I use the word advisedly, of global sort of opinion, respectable opinion, consensus opinion about this conflict, wouldn't some of the resolutions and sort of UN postures of past years have carried more weight? And wouldn't the United States, to the extent that this would be something that could actually be done, have to change its posture in the UN Security Council such that it became more of a even-handed broker and self-interested actor, and less of a sort of reflexive supporter of protecting Israel from what otherwise would be the depredations of a UN General Assembly and perhaps Security Council that were less sympathetic to the Israelis than are the United States? Yeah,
I would say a couple of things. First of all, you're right. It assumes a big change in American policy, that the president suddenly feels untrammeled by domestic political constraints. And we would have to play what would be a very surprising role in all this. I kind of think that if you even assume all of that, which is assuming more than you're going to get, in a way the hope would be that you don't have to get to the point of imposing the solution, that once you set the wheels in motion, Israel starts getting serious about negotiating in a way that it hasn't. That would be one. I've made the same argument about what the Palestinians could do, which is if they got serious, if they just said, okay, forget two-state, we just want the vote. We just want to vote. And start building up a peaceful movement that would say that, it would draw huge international support. I think that would put pressure on the Israelis such that you didn't wind up maybe with a one-state solution these Palestinians would be advocating, and you actually got more generous offers from Israel on a two-state. But, look, it was, I wouldn't quite call it a flight of fancy, but let's say I was just, freeing myself of some of the constraints actually imposed by reality in sketching out that scenario.
Well, that can be a useful exercise from time to time.
Yeah, how many times do you get the opportunity? So,
Bob, it was a great pleasure talking with you today.
Same here, Glenn, and I want to thank you for for all the stuff you've done for Blogging Heads.
I know my reward's coming in heaven, Bob. I just can't wait.
You think before the IPO, before we do the IPO and distribute stock freely among all the people who have?
No, I've been promised a certain number. I won't say virgins, okay? I've been promised a certain number of wonderful experiences.
Oh, that we can do. Is that you want to stop?
In the afterlife. No, actually, stock wouldn't be bad. If there's going to be an IPO, make sure you run that by me and give me a preferential option, okay?
Okay, I'll let you, you're an economist. You can do the stock virgins trade-off and draw a little graph and decide how you want to go in the end.
Yeah, that one's got a kink in it, but okay.
We should probably take this offline at this point, Glenn.
Take care, Bob.
Okay, you too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.